Well, this is my session, Code That Writes Code, Demystifying Dynamic SQL. My name is Collin Lysford, and here's what we're going to be covering today. We're going to kind of talk about what dynamic SQL is, what does it do. We're going to talk about when to use it, because it's a sometimes treat for sure. And then the kind of the biggest reason I wanted to do this session, which is the resolutions to common errors, because a lot of people's stumbling block with dynamic SQL is that the error message aren't especially useful, so it can be really hard to figure out when your dynamic SQL goes wrong how to fix it. So we're going to get you some knowledge there. We're going to talk about SQL injection, which you might have heard about, and you might be wondering, well, I use SQL. I don't know how to inject any SQL. So we're going to finally cover what that is. Talk very briefly about performance. This isn't a performance-focused talk. The talk after this one, Eric Darling, does have a performance-focused talk, which is going to be very good, and I'm very excited for. But performance is kind of its own thing, so I'm not going to give it the justice it truly deserves. Just a couple of brief notes as it pertains to dynamic SQL. And then finally, we're going to go into a script I have written to kind of solve a real-world problem with dynamic SQL. I'm happy to take questions throughout. Also, because this is sort of an introduction session to something I know that some people on this Zoom will already know, if you kind of want to give not a question but a comment and say, I think it'd be good for you to cover this, I'm happy to hear those too, with the sole caveat that please, look at this order I'm going to talk about things and wait until I've kind of had a chance first, because SQL injection, the code I'm going to show in my first demos, will be vulnerable to SQL injection. That's deliberate. I don't want to talk about it until the point where I have it on the agenda. So first off, who am I? What is this session about? To give you some context as to me, I've been a developer for about 6 years. I first was a BI developer at Epic Systems, which is the healthcare system, not the Fortnite company. I did a stint as a DBA at SVA Consulting, and I now work as a report developer at El Camino Health in Mountain View, California, which is why I was talking about those Diablo wins and the danger that I might have my power cut. So I do want to note that while I was graciously given the day to present by El Camino Health, I'm presenting this as an individual. If you have a problem with this presentation, take it up with me, not my boss. Thank you. I also have some links. If you want to reach out to me, I'll also share these links again at the end of the session, but you can email me, collin.lysford@gmail. On LinkedIn, you can add me and I'll kind of share any SQL-related content I come up with. I also have my Twitter handle @CollinLysford, but unlike my LinkedIn, I do not have a SQL-only Twitter account. It's one Twitter account for my entire life. So there's going to be SQL stuff, sure, but also some pro League of Legends, also some jokes, just generalized chicanery. So definitely buyer beware on following that one. So we're going to go right into the first demo, and I need to find the button to change what I am sharing, and it is here. So everybody's seeing a SQL window now?
No, I think we still see the demo
Okay,
slide.
you still see the slides. Okay, let me try now.
Yeah, I still see the
There
Yay!
we go.
All right. So all of the demos I'm going to show today, I also haven't figured out how we're going to distribute them, but I'll work with the GroupBy folks. We'll get these in your hands one way or another, along with the transcript of the session. These are all from the Stack Overflow data dump, the 10 gigabyte version, which is under the Creative Commons Share-alike license 4.0 or perhaps 3.0. There is some concern about how they've actually migrated their license, but it's under some share-alike license or another. I'm allowed to do this. And the dump has been served off by Brent Ozar, which for those of you who don't know him, was the original founder of the GroupBy conference before he turned it over to our wonderful volunteer team here. So what's dynamic SQL? Well, first off, what's regular SQL? It's I'm not trying to get esoteric on you here, but as a normal SQL statement, you just have some commands, you hit it, you know it, you love it. Dynamic SQL, we're going to first take that command, we're going to write it to a variable, okay? And then we're going to use this thing called sp execute SQL. You can also do it by writing exec. I don't recommend doing this, and we'll get into why sort of as the session goes on. And we highlight that, we hit F5, and it's the same result, right? If I run them both together. So when you look at this, you may be thinking, what's the point of that? I had this beautiful formatted SQL. You made it like an ugly single red color. And then I needed 3 extra lines to get it done. This technique is pointless. You are a degenerate and a fraud for bringing it before me today. And if you feel that way, you're going to still feel that way with the second demo, because this is another example of dynamic SQL being completely useless. You'll see here we've now declared a variable called table1. We're setting it to be comments, and we're setting our SQL to be select top 10 from, and we're concatenating it with comments so that when we run it, it selects the top 10 from comments. And again, I could have just written select top 10 from comments. What is the point of this technique? Well, the point of this technique, you might be starting to think about it. I just set the comments variable literally, right? I didn't have to, though. There's a lot of ways you can set a variable, some of them more tricky than others. So here's our third example, and finally, dynamic SQL is going to have a point. We're going to select the newest table. So this, you don't need to worry too much about this query. All it's going to do, select into table 2, the table that was most recently modified, because maybe you want to have this monitoring script that says, hey, whenever we modify a table, let's make sure we can still select from it, right? Make sure you didn't blow it up somehow. So what this query does is it selects the top 10 from votes, because votes is the table that was modified most recently. But what's interesting about this, what makes this better than just writing select top 10 star from votes, is that if I make the comments, I add a column to the comments table, right? Then I don't need to go back to my script and say, okay, now the most recent thing that was changed was comments. We'll write it as comments. This query, every time you run it, will go and find out what the most recently modified table was, and it will select the top 10 rows from that table. And finally, this last example, a little more complicated, but it's another good example of when dynamic SQL can save you a lot of tedium. So let's create this table called clustered indices. It's just going to have ID, table name, and that. Now, I'm not going to make you read this whole query because it's a little complicated. All right, I'm going to just show you. Believe me when I say that what this query has done, it has grabbed every clustered index off of our table. This is a very small, or database, sorry. And this is a very small database, the Stack Overflow 2010 demo database. There's only 9 tables, and every single clustered index has the name ID, and it's all single column indices. So let's say I wanted to know what the largest ID was for each table, right? You can imagine how you'd write this. You'd go, okay, select max ID from comments, union all, select max link types from ID from link types, union all, select max ID from post links, union all. It's going to get pretty tedious. And every time we add a new table, you're going to have to add it to that freaking union all statement. Is there a better way? Well, I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't have a better way. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare our variable we're going to write our SQL to in our table name variable, but also we're going to declare loop and loop max. And we're going to say loop max is the max ID from our temp table. So this isn't the max ID from any one table. This is the max ID from this table, because when we made it, we gave it an identity int column so we would know how many rows were in this table, right? This table is how many clustered indices do we have? Well, we have 9. So select the max from that, saying, I want to loop 9 times, okay? And now I want to say, while loop is greater than loop max, so the 0 greater than 9, add 1 to it, go fix the loop table from clustered indices, and then build the string like this that says select table name as table ID from here, where ID equals select max ID from table name. And if it's anything but the last clustered index in our table, let's go ahead and throw that union all on there too, okay? So let me put it all together here. I'll highlight everything but the execute. Look at that tedious query I talked about us having to write. I didn't have to write it. I made the system write it for me. And not only did I make the system write it for me, I made the system ensure that when stuff changes later, it's going to rewrite it for me, so I don't need to remember to do it. And we'll see here, there are 8. The biggest value in post types is 8. The biggest in vote types is 16. The biggest link type is 3. Whereas for comments, we have something like 91 million. For badges, we have 27 million. And there you go. That's the kind of thing that dynamic SQL can do for you. So do we have any questions from that first demo?
So
Go
it
ahead.
doesn't look like everyone's just sitting back and enjoying.
Excellent. So we'll go back to the slide deck here and say, okay, what did we learn from that? So we're using dynamic SQL. What we mean is that you're having a SQL string that needs to be built at runtime, right? The SQL didn't exist when I opened this window, this cool union all thing I'm doing. When I double clicked this demo, I opened it. This literally didn't exist. I made the system think of this by executing it. I went one slide too ahead. This allows you to have your code adapt to the current state of the database, instead of you needing to go and manually keep everything in lockstep. And as we saw in the last example, this will let you write a bunch of highly similar sections of code in a faster and safer way. Now, why do I say safer? I say safer because if you're sitting union all select post as table ID, maybe you might write like union all one time because you just fat finger it, right? So it also just makes it less likely your code's gonna have a mistake because you know what I mean? You write the code once and then it repeats itself perfectly because that's what computers are good at. So the analogy I like to use for dynamic SQL versus regular, it's like cars versus airplanes, okay? So why do I say that? Normal SQL, it's like getting in a car. It's quick, it's easy. You open the door, you get in, you turn the key. You can usually drive directly or close to directly to your destination. Generally speaking, especially in America, a nation kind of built for cars, adding a car doesn't add a lot of extra distance to a journey over something like walking. But there are some places you can't go. If you're here in North America, you want to go visit our colleagues maybe in England to congratulate them for their good talks yesterday. You can't drive over the Atlantic Ocean. You need a better way. And if you've got a very long trip, for example, when I moved from Minnesota to California, it wasn't very convenient. I mean, we could do it. We did it. Wasn't my favorite way to go. Dynamic SQL, it's kind of like an airplane, right? Airplanes will always have this minimum level of fuss. Just like in dynamic SQL, we always needed to make a variable called SQL. We always needed to use SP-execute SQL. We always need to deal with the fact that we don't have our pretty text formatting. It's all red. Just like when you're in an airplane, you've always got to get in. You've always got to check in through security. You've always got to get your boarding pass. And sometimes you need to take intermediate connections, right? Sometimes with dynamic SQL, writing this code didn't look like the way I write code. I had to futz around with loop and loop max. And I kind of had to have this scaffolding to make it do what I wanted. But the farther the destination, the more time it saves, okay? So this example with the 9, even with the 9 tables, writing that dynamic SQL was pretty nice to not need to write those 9, tables for the union all statement. Imagine this was a more regular database. Imagine we had 10,000 tables, okay? That dynamic SQL that I wrote would still work with 10,000 tables. I wouldn't need to do any extra work to scale it up. So a lot of times, the farther the destination, the bigger the code that you need to end up with, the more time you save by writing it dynamically. So when to use dynamic SQL? Well, when you find yourself doing a lot of copy pasting, okay? That should trigger your spidey senses to go, well, hang on a second. I'm copy pasting. That means that there's this fundamental deep similarity in the queries I want to write. Like in this example, where all we wanted to do was change the table we were selecting from, right? Well, if I've got these deep similarities and I'm copy pasting, maybe that's a sign that this should just be a dynamic query instead, okay? Another thing is if you're writing queries with a lot of different modes. Now, this is a little bit weirder, and we'll kind of look at this a bit more as we go. But the way to think about this is if you've got a lot of parameters that are already changing what variables are doing in a query, and like the results that you get could end up being very different one to another. If you write your queries dynamically, then they're kind of cleaner in a sense, because you can compile exactly the query you need with no sort of cruft that relates to stuff you don't need. And finally, if you'd like to do the same thing to different tables, because like we saw in this example, you can't, in a regular SQL statement, union all and say, I want the variable to tell me what table to use. You need dynamic SQL to say, I want to do the same thing to different tables. So you've got some sort of utility that wants to scan every table in your database and do this, that, or the other thing. Dynamic SQL is often the way to go. So now we're going to talk about roadblocks and the ways around them. This is the meat of the session, as it were. So let's go and flip our share back to our SQL window. Once again, this is the same Stack Overflow data dump. So first thing to look at, and a quick caveat I want to give here is that these queries really don't need to be dynamic. I've kind of made queries that are as small as possible and still show the error with dynamic SQL. What that means is I'm not really presenting you with a use case why you would need dynamic SQL, okay? These are just examples to show you errors and how to fix them. So the first one is, let's say I have this query, select top 100 from posts, and maybe sometimes I want to do some additional joins. So I have this plus additional joins variable. So if I want to add a inner join, blah, 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 I can do that. But let's say I'm running this in a mode where I don't need that functionality, okay? I just want to select top 100 from posts. Well, great. Just gonna hit F5. Commands completed successfully. Well, I said select top 100 and you didn't. It doesn't feel very successful to me. But you can't really Google this error message, right? You can't say, hey, I got this commands completed successfully error. And I don't like that it says that because that's wrong. Well, as it turns out, the error is here. We had additional joins. We didn't end up needing any, but we're still concatenating it with the string. Now, SQL, as you might remember, has a tripartite logic system where things can be true or false or null. And when they were implementing this, some developer at Microsoft, probably consumed with existential despair, thought, well, if something is empty, and you combine that with something that isn't empty, emptiness is so pervasive that emptiness and something together is indistinguishable from nothingness at all, okay? So if you concatenate a null with a string, it will blow up that string. Now, this isn't specific to dynamic SQL. This is just a function of SQL. By dynamic SQL is sort of the main arena you will notice that if you concatenate a null with something, it will blow up your whole string. Fortunately, the fix is easy. All we need to do is set it to the empty string at the start and run it. And as any good monk will tell you, emptiness is different from nothingness. And so this will work just fine. And we'll get our 100. So this is just a warning. Make sure that if you are joining stuff, concatenating the variables in the dynamic SQL statement, they always have to have some value, even if it's just the empty string, because if you concatenate a null in SQL Server, it blows up the whole string. Okay, apostrophes. Let's say in Stack Overflow, they have their different post types. And let's say we make a new post type called just read an O'Reilly book, because we're sick of telling people to just go read O'Reilly books. So let's make it one button, you can smash it, just read an O'Reilly book, get on with your life. Well, one thing you'll notice already is we have to do this funny double apostrophe thing. So for those who don't know, this is what's called an escape character. And basically what that's saying is, since this is a string, and with just one of this, we would know that, okay, this is the end of my string. So we need a second apostrophe right after it to say, no, 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 no. I didn't want to end the string. I just want to put an apostrophe inside my string. So I need one apostrophe to be the apostrophe, and a second apostrophe to say, hey, you know that apostrophe right in front of me? That guy's legit. He's a real apostrophe. Let him in. So we have this escape character, and we want to go add to the post types table, just read an O'Reilly book. We'll see here the post types table currently has 8 post types in it. We want to make the new one for just read an O'Reilly book. We're going to do this in a transaction so that these examples don't hang out. Incorrect syntax near the word read, unclosed quotation marks after the character string Riley book. Because if you look here in the statement we actually created, and I moved it around, and we'll open a new window to look at this a bit better. This was a string, but we didn't treat it like a string inside. So even without this O'Reilly problem, it wouldn't work. And then with the O'Reilly problem, it just becomes a really, really cryptic and confusing error message. Well, that's fine. We need to treat it like a string. That's easy to do. What we'll do is we'll put 2 more. Now, why do we have 2 more and not 1 more string to put it like a string? Because remember, we're saying insert into post types type values, right? And then we have this first apostrophe that's telling SQL, I'm ending the string. And then the second apostrophe saying, no, 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 don't listen. That first guy, he's not ending the string. He's in the string. He belongs here. And then we have this third apostrophe that's saying, all right, I'm ending the string though. And then we bring in just read an O'Reilly book. And then once again, we have this first one to say, hey, I'm starting the string. And then the second guy says, all right, and I'm ending the string. Then the third apostrophe says, no, 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 no. That first guy started the string. Second string, you're not ending the string. You're in the string, second apostrophe. And then we have this, and then this fourth apostrophe that says, and I am ending the string. So let's go ahead and run that here. Oh, it still failed. But at least we made some progress when we paste this. This one only failed because of this O'Reilly book thing. If O'Reilly didn't have an apostrophe, you see from this IntelliSense, this is a valid SQL statement. But because we had the double quote outside, it became a single quote when we moved it in. Because remember, when we were setting this literal variable, we needed to have 2 apostrophes to tell it that when you're storing to the variable, actually store it to 1. But then we sort of, again, read what was written in the variable and put it down. And that means that we actually needed to still maintain this as an escape character, and we didn't. So what does that mean? It means we still have this same, just read an O'Reilly book. We still have our same scenario where we're telling it the thing that we're about to put here is a string. But then we have this replace statement. And this is going to get a little wild with apostrophes, so I'm going to walk you through it, okay? Replace is a SQL argument that says, take a string, take one thing you find in the string, turn it to this other thing I tell you to. And what is this saying? It's saying, what am I looking for? Well, the first apostrophe says, we're looking for a string. The second apostrophe says, close the string, I'm looking for the empty string. The third apostrophe says, ignore that second apostrophe when he said he was going to close the string. He and I together represents the one apostrophe I want you to look for. And then the fourth apostrophe ends the string. What are we replacing it? Well, the first apostrophe says, the thing we're replacing it with is a string. The second apostrophe says, we're replacing it with the empty string. The third apostrophe says, don't listen to that second apostrophe, we're replacing it with a single apostrophe. This fourth apostrophe says, well, I'm going to end the string. The fifth apostrophe says, no, don't listen to that fourth apostrophe when he says he's going to end the string. He's a real apostrophe, he's coming in with me. And then the sixth apostrophe says, I am ending the string. And then same as goes here. And we begin tran, and sure enough, I did not highlight everything. We've succeeded. Just read an O'Reilly book has showed up. And if you look at what it spawned, it's because that replace statement gave us the extra apostrophe that we need. So that is, and you'll notice pretty quickly, it's very important to keep track of your apostrophes, which is why I have these sort of annoying little stories. And one of the downsides to dynamic SQL is once it starts getting a little bit complicated, it kind of looks like there was a bloody accident at a rice factory, right? Just a lot of little red ticks scattered about everywhere. And it's just something you're going to have to live with, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so someone was asking a question, or maybe half making a statement saying dynamic SQL needs a built-in method to escape variables. Is there anything like that? Probably not if you're showing us tons and tons of apostrophe replaces.
So the answer is that, again, as good philosophers will say, I can't say, is there anything like that? I can't give a definitive negative, because this is kind of how I work with dynamic SQL, because when I use dynamic SQL, I sometimes need to go through a lot of layers of string processing. So I'm hesitant to trust any sort of runtime handling of escapes. I'm not going to say there's no elegant way to escape it. This is how I do it. And maybe somebody can chime in if they have a sort of cleaner way they handle escape variables than what I'm doing here. But this is what I do. And the advantage is that, yeah, it kind of gets a little messy on the home stretch here, but I don't like trusting sort of the execute statements to do my escape handling, because I kind of like to have the exact string to get my hand on at any given time. But thank you for the question, Todd. Any other questions before I go to the next example?
No, I don't think so.
Excellent.
Well, Daniel was just saying in the chat that a lesser known function is quote name in brackets is one thing he just said, and he said, I guess you could pass a variable into sp_execute SQL. Not really a question, just bouncing off what you said as well there.
Yes. So passing a variable, that's true. That is one way to escape, and we will cover passing in variables a little later on. So that's a good point. That's
Awesome.
not the main reason I passed in variables, that it is another side effect, as you can do one less layer of quote handling when you pass them in that way. But for now, we're going to go on to dates, okay? Dates are very important. As you know, they're probably the data type that causes the most consternation and grief because they're probably the easiest one to do off by one errors and not notice. I'm not bitter. So let's go ahead and say, these are the votes that somebody voted for something in Stack Overflow. I want to look at votes that happened at least 10 years ago, which may sound like it's going to do a lot of data, but since this is, of course, the Stack Overflow 2010 dump, and it's 2019 now, this is actually only going to give us a year or so of data. So let's go ahead and look at that data. Varchar and date are incompatible in the add operator. So I tried to take creation date, and I tried to add it to vote date, but vote date's a date, and this is a string, and SQL's like, what are you trying to do, adding a string to a date? What am I supposed to do with that? That's like asking, hey, what's the sum of Collin plus Thursday? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's just not a question worth asking. So like, oh, okay, I know how to handle this. I'll cast it as a date. Brilliant. So easy. There's no rows. Shouldn't there be rows? You said 2010, it's 2019, there should still be a year of rows. Well, let's look at the statement we've actually spawned off, okay? Turns out that this literal, SQL doesn't exactly know what to do with it. And in this case, it finds nothing, right? So we need to do better. We need to turn our date into a string when we're concatenating it, but it still needs to act like a date within the query. And there's two ways to handle that, and I'm going to show you both of them. So one thing, it's our good friends, you know them, you love them, having apostrophes hang out with each other to bring themselves within the string. I will not give you the little apostrophe narrative this time. I will trust that you can follow along on your own. And this works. You see we get our 6,759 votes. If we look at what we spawned off, oh, it's a new window. Nice and handy. So this works. Now, why do I do the air quotes? And unlike William, who decided to present with his camera off, my camera's on. You can see I'm doing air quotes. And the reason I do air quotes is because this is an implicit conversion, right? So we have this vote date. We're saying take however it gets, when you take your date and turn it to a string through this in Varchar cast, do whatever that ended up looking like and bring it in as a string. And this works, but it's kind of fragile, right? In SQL land, we really like to explicitly cast stuff when we get a chance. We like to say, I have this thing, and I want it to be exactly this. And with date, oftentimes you say, and I want the date in this style. And we didn't do that here. We just kind of hoped that it worked out, and it did. But there is a better way. It's a little more complicated, but this is a really important technique. This is a really important technique because in a dynamic SQL query, just like any regular query, you still need to have control of your data types. You still need to use cast and convert pretty liberally because that's a foundational part of SQL, is getting your data types right. And so this limitation where your outer variable needs to be a string to be concatenated doesn't change the fact that we need to handle what it is inside. So the way you do that is we do this sort of wacky double cast, okay? So we have vote date here, just like we usually did, just like we did before. We're still casting it, but now we're saying inside the string cast, take our usual double apostrophe to say what's coming in as a string, pass in the string we built, but now here I can within the query still cast it to be whatever I want it to be. I can still do all the normal casting or converting or any other function on this value. So that's the technique, is to say, what I'm passing in as a string, tell the query inside that it's a string via our double apostrophe here, but then do unto that string whatever you need to do to bring it back to whatever it was as a value. So this works for integers just as well, or any other data type that you cast to a string. So we run it, and again, we get the same result, but this time we're doing it with an explicit cast. So if we wanted this to have some other formatting, we would now have that function. So this double cast kind of mindset is something that's very important to get a hang of. Now, finally, let's say that, like you do, you cast the first chapter of The Count of Monte Cristo to a variable so you can read it later. It's out of copyright. It's a fantastic book. And I want to put it in my variable so I can give it a read. I'll scroll down. We can see the last sentence of The Count of Monte Cristo's first chapter is, on turning round, the owner saw Danglars behind him, apparently awaiting orders, but in reality also watching the young sailor. But there was a great difference in the expression of the two men, who thus followed the movements of Edmond Dantes. Well, I want to know what happened. That was a pretty good last sentence. I want to read the rest of the sentences. So let's go up here. Let's do our Control-Shift-End, highlight everything. And there we go. I can read this book that I set to this variable. And we can see that dramatic last sentence. We're. Well, hold on. I thought they were watching Edmond Dantes walk away. I don't think the last part of the first chapter was we are. So it turns out that this is a limitation with the messaging functionality in SQL. You can only have 4,000 characters worth of nvarchar or 8,000 characters worth of varchar in this messages tab when you print it out. Okay? Now this is a problem because, as you've noticed, we've been using the print SQL and pasting to other windows. We're trying to get our heads around exactly what it is we're doing with our SQL statements, right? It's a really important way to debug is just see what statement did I end up building, how do I work with it? And there's a couple of ways you can handle this. The first one, I put it below, but I'm gonna, no, we'll do the more complicated one first. The first you can do is kind of code a sort of print big helper function. So we'll see here, what if instead of just printing SQL, I will print substring 1 to 4,000, and then I'll go start at character 4,000 and do 4,000 more characters, okay? So let's go on to the top here. My cat woke up. Brief aside, you might think it's more professional to lock the cat out of where you're working.
Show us the cat. Show us the cat.
If he comes out, I'm not gonna come around and grab him, but here he comes. The thing is, if I close the door, he would just meow at that door even louder. So we can't possibly stop him. Just think of him as a furry little terrorist holding all of our time hostage. You want to at least come up here, Tinker? Or do you just want to meow and you just want to annoy everybody? Okay, well, maybe he'll jump up and maybe he won't. He's his own man. He'll interrupt us. That's just the price of having cats. But anyway, I've uncommented those substring prints. So let's go ahead and Control-Shift-End, F5. And now we didn't end at we are because we came here. We probably should have taken out that line break, but this was a quick example. And now we got some more stuff. And then we end at we, which is still not, they thus followed the movements of Edmond Dantes, but it's more. So what you could see is you could print some sort of helper function that says, hey, print this, then eat up the line break, print this next one, and just keep printing these substrings until you've reached the length of the column, right? You could just make your own little UDF function, call it print big or whatever you want to call it. And that's one way you could get around this limitation. Another limitation is instead of printing, you can just select. It's one of those things where selecting a single string instead of a value set, it's not something you normally need to do. So you kind of don't think that you can do it, but you can. There's nothing wrong with it. It just looks weird, right? It's this tiny little one by one result. But if I go to new query and paste, there was a great difference in the expression of the two men who thus followed the movements of Edmond Dantes. So we got the full thing. This does have a length limit, but it's somewhere in the tens of thousands, and I haven't found what it is exactly. Eventually, you will break the limitations of even select to return your string, but it can go a hell of a lot farther than print can. And you'll notice we did nvarchar because you got this little wacky accent above the E. So that's good, but I had this nice formatting to read it. I really liked that. Okay, well, jump up then, buddy. Don't just keep meowing about you're gonna jump up and wasting all of our time. Just jump up if you're gonna jump up. He's very indecisive. All right. Is Tinker?
Yes.
Okay. Now, sit properly. Gonna go out of focus because I showed a new face, so let me. Okay, and you might see his tail photobomb me, but hopefully he will lay on my lap and calm down and let me finish my session. Or maybe not. He's a renegade. So anyway, you'll notice here there's this file path I put here, query options, results, grid, retain CRLF on copy or save. For those of you who don't know, CR means carriage return, line feed, LF means line feed. These are references to the typewriter age for what it would actually physically do on a typewriter to end a line, kind of go to a new line at the first character. So we're going to retain CRLFs on copy or save. We're going to do this, and we're going to go run this statement again, but with that new setting enabled. I copy, going to go new window, and you'll notice that now we have our line breaks. So this is important because I recommend, when possible in your dynamic SQL strings, putting in line breaks so it formats just like regular code you would write, as it's a lot easier to interpret than a single long row, right? And if you do that, you'll need to have the setting enabled to actually get the benefit of your line breaks. So those are all of the sort of like the common errors I hit a lot and that don't have very transparent failure reasons. For questions, I do notice one comment from London DBA. Says, alternative to the double cast is to use convert's third parameter to return the string in the ISO date format, i.e. 2019-10-21. The system would then know what to do with it in the ISO format. That's a very good point for dates specifically. I like to show the double cast because obviously sometimes, you know, you're going to need to cast it within the string whether you like it or not, but that's a very good point from London DBA that for dates specifically, we could use convert, and in convert's third argument, you can specify a locale. And if that locale is the ISO standard, I mean, you'd better believe that the inner SQL is going to know what to do with an ISO standard formatted date. So thank you, London DBA. And does anybody in the Slack have anything more? Also,
no, I don't think I see anything in the Slack.
No, we're all good on questions. I just started a poll asking how much people love Tinker the Cat, and so far everyone has voted yes.
Excellent.
It is also the only option I have provided.
Irrelevant. Okay, so that's good. Now I'm going to go back to the presentation very briefly here. To kind of recap, these are the common errors that stopped progress, that are hard to Google, and you can now solve with dynamic SQL, right? If it seems like your string just went missing, look for everything you've concatenated, try to spot the null. Remember, nothingness is different from emptiness. The empty string is fine. It's null specifically. If you've got something in quotes that isn't working, see if some apostrophes need a friend. Maybe they're just lonely, right? And make sure that sort of you look at the final SQL statement you've generated. Does that have the right number of apostrophes? Or do you need to double up or quadruple up or something outside to get the apostrophes to flow properly inside? Do you have a data type error when you're concatenating? Well, the outside string needs to be varchar and varchar to match your main string. And then inside, you can recast it to be your correct value. And finally, if it's not printing your full query for debugging, write a little helper function that will loop your print statements, or just try selecting and turning on query options, results, grid, retain CRLF on copy or save. So these are some sort of non-transparent problems you can get around. But there's a danger with dynamic SQL that doesn't announce itself. Okay, all of these, you got an error. You knew you had to find something wrong. This one doesn't announce itself. And it could destroy your company if you're not careful. That's right, my friends. We have reached the SQL injection demo. So here's our example query. Let's say there's some sort of web app that you've built that lets you look over Stack Overflow contributions, and you filter it by answer, okay? So here are the post types. Type 2 is answer. Let's say you want to go and look at everything from post types where the type is answer. Okay, there's one row in post types, ID 2, value answer. Nice and easy. So the user says, hey, what post type do you want to like check in the ID for? And he says, I want to know the ID for answer. And then your database is like, oh, great, answer, here's the row. The ID is 2 for answer. Have a great day. Well, let's say same web form for a different user. I see Eric has joined. Hello, Eric. Same web app, same different user. And they say, okay, what type do you want to know about? And the user's like, oh, I want to know about answer, double quote, semicolon, insert into post types, types, value, banana, semicolon, dash, dash. And then your system's like, oh, answer, apostrophe, apostrophe, semicolon, insert into post types, types, values, banana, semicolon, dash, dash. Sure, let me look at the database. And you see now, we still returned exactly the same row, right, to answer. If you have some sort of validation script that's making sure that this gets returned, this still got returned. But post types now has this value, banana. And you see the reason this works, we'll go into new query to kind of break it down. We did a semicolon to say, terminate that query, start a new query, do the new query, and then because we knew the real query was going to add one more apostrophe to the end, and we didn't want to make an error, we didn't want to let anybody know we were doing this, we did a double dash to just eliminate all of the code that comes after in this concatenation, okay? And this is just kind of a fun and cute example, right? All we did is we added banana. But a lot of times when you've got these sort of web apps that you're interfacing to, I mean, you could be doing it with some sort of crazy elevated permissions. Now this person, instead of setting it banana, what if they took their own account and elevated the permissions, right? What if they took their salary and added 2 zeros, right? What if they took your data and they dumped it somewhere? There's a lot of bad things you can do. So how do you defend yourself from SQL injection? Because this is a really good technique. I don't want to get rid of it just because some punk can pull this kind of stuff. Well, I mean, one way is never use dynamic SQL where it's exposed to a user, right? I mean, if all this stuff is internal ETLs, that the only people who can edit them are people who have access to the database anyway, and they only run it with their own credentials, then they could just write this SQL themselves and it wouldn't matter. But that's not a satisfactory answer for a lot of people, obviously. I just want to point that out. Well, one way you can fix it, externally validate the parameter. So here we're doing the same thing. We're setting the post type and we're running the same query, but now we're checking if exists the post type. If we can find that there's going to return a row when we do this, then execute it. Otherwise, just say value not found. So this will still work for the legitimate user who wants to return answer. But if this person comes back instead and says, set it to be banana, then we're going to get error not found because it says, I don't know, man. I checked post types. Not a single type has the name answer, apostrophe, apostrophe, semicolon, insert into post types. I didn't find it. So that's one very easy, very good way to just externally validate your parameters before you do anything with them and make sure the parameters are the kind of things you expect them to be. Another thing, and this goes back to what was mentioned earlier, someone in chat linked the XKCD comment with little Bobby tables. I did not bring it up. That was on purpose. We need to move on as a society. Okay, it had its run. It's a good comic.
I think we all agree.
We can move on. I won't say the name. Anyway, another thing you can do, and this was mentioned earlier by somebody who brought up that this is also a way to handle that quote, needing the extra quotes that I brought up, is SP execute SQL has this functionality where I can define an inner parameter. In this case, I'll call it post type for inner. And when I do this, I'll say, well, let me actually look for ones where the type equals post type for inner. And then I will set post type for inner equal to post type for. So now somebody wrote the same malevolent code, but because I made it a parameter inside, it kind of did this same thing where it didn't run this like you would run code. It compared to it like you would compare a normal string value because I passed it inside SP execute SQL as this sort of inner variable. So those are two techniques. One other thing you will notice is that I made post type for a max length and varchar. If it had been shorter, this couldn't have happened. And that's true. Restricting your data types will kind of defend you against SQL injection. But sooner or later, you're going to have a legitimate use case for a string that's long enough to do something naughty. So restricting your data types is never sufficient as a defense, so I don't like to recommend it. You should make sure your strings are as thin as they need to be for storage concerns, but don't make an argument that it dramatically assists your security. You really need to handle it one way or the other. Otherwise, either always use this functionality of SP execute SQL, or, and I would argue or, right? Try to do both. Validate parameters before you start concatenating them and make sure they're the kind of things that you expect. Because this also leads to your code having good error handling, so when a legitimate user mistypes something, they'll get a nice descriptive message about what they did wrong. So does anybody have any questions about SQL injection or comments?
Just looking it over, I think we're pretty good. People just talking about your session, enjoying it, sharing the odd comic, but no direct
Waiting
questions.
for Tinker to come back.
Yeah,
He's behind the green screen. I have no idea. So.
Maybe one here.
Go back.
JD Walker's wondering how you feel about dropping any part of the input string after the semicolon.
After the semicolon, it's one of those things that for certain strings, it's a decent defense. Some places will kind of like run like these utility functions that will do that for like anytime they run dynamic SQL. But if we go back to kind of Monte Cristo here, I bet there's probably a semicolon in here somewhere, right? Yeah, provide the young sailor gravely, she is my betrothed. And someone will write an issue ticket that says, hold on, I want to know what the young sailor said gravely after she is not my mistress. I know he said something else. What did he say? And then some app developer is going to have to write some sort of workaround that gets around your semicolon handling in some cases. And semicolons come up often enough that you'll need that workaround, not so often that everybody always remembers it, and then the hacker is going to get in through that workaround instead. So if you are sure that you have a field that never ever needs a legitimate semicolon, sure. As you kind of start expanding the use cases, you're going to find that semicolons show up in real life sooner or later. And again, you're going to need, it's kind of the same as restricting your data types, where it can help. It's not a sufficient defense, so I don't like to advocate for it too strongly. Thank you for the question. Oh, sorry, I just realized that I'm showing the slide deck, so I did validate that there was a semicolon in Count of Monte Cristo, but I guess you just had to believe me because I was showing.
I heard it, you know, in the way that you said it. The mental image was definitely there.
So this is not quite the conclusion, but it's going to sound like a conclusion. Albert Einstein never said, never memorize anything you can look up in a book. That is a populist sort of pop quote summary of his real quotation, which is, I do not carry such information in my mind since it is readily available in books. The value of a college education is not the learning of many facts, but the training of the minds to think, which is still kind of close. Also, we're in the North America time slot. It's 2019. Facts don't matter anymore. So Albert Einstein once said, never memorize anything you can look up in a book. And similarly, there are really only two things you really got to remember here. And the first is dynamic SQL. When do I use it? What does it help with? You need to remember that, or you'll never know to invoke these techniques in the first place. And you need to remember, sanitize your inputs if there's any chance that an external user could fiddle with the stuff that you're concatenating to your string. Everything else, if you forget it, you're going to hit an error. You'll be like, that's an error. How do I fix it? That's right. Collin did a presentation. GroupBy does these excellent transcripts. I can control F. Ah, I found it. But you'll never even know to start if you forget the first thing. And if you forget the second thing, no one's going to remind you until the hacker telling you how much it's going to cost to get your data back. Okay? So if you can only remember two things, remember these two. If you can only remember one thing, don't bother remembering anything, because if you remember the first bit and not the second bit, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. So as we're moving on, we've got about 10 minutes. So these are some very brief notes, like I said, about performance. We're not going fully into it. Basically, something to know is that SP execute SQL can save the plans that it generates, and the exec statement can't. So what that means is that if you got XP execute SQL, just like a normal query, if you rerun it multiple times, SQL can be smart enough to reuse that plan. This can give you an error of what's called parameter sniffing, where if you change your parameters such that you did a really small result set the first time, a really big result set the second time, SQL might under or over allocate resources because it thinks you're going to act like the first time when it's different in the second time. If you want to flush the plan, you can just use exec in all caps, and that will make a new plan every time. I recommend never using exec, and you can use an option recompile hint on XP execute SQL. Because what that does is that shows you made a deliberate choice to flush the plan, and it wasn't just that you didn't know about SP execute SQL. Option recompile, if you're running this query like less than like once a second, it's really not that big a deal to just compile a new plan every time. SQL is pretty good at compiling plans unless it's something that's kind of part of your database that users are hitting over and over and over, like a stored procedure. So that's one thing to note. Something else that's interesting is dynamic SQL can improve performance. Again, I don't have a lab for this just for time constraints, but if you've ever seen this design pattern where you're saying, I have this clause, look for the vote type that matches the variable, but I might sometimes set the variable to all to say, give me every vote type, and essentially annihilate this clause from the where clause, right? And the more you have the type of these, I guess I should have said predicates instead of clauses here. The more you have this design pattern, the more you have complicated and or stuff, SQL has to work harder to figure out what the hell it's going to do about your query. So if you've got one of these really modular queries where variables can sometimes like mean you need to join to something versus not join to something, means that it's A or B and C. If it's like this, where you're saying check for this or do all of them, dynamic SQL might actually improve the performance of an existing query because now all that exists are the stuff that you actually need for this run. It doesn't have all this ornamental cruft that essentially corresponds to what SQL should do in situations that aren't the situation you're in now. So that's just a little plug that if you've got some big monster query with a lot of these, rewriting it to be dynamic might actually improve things even if you already have the query done. Finally, for the remainder of our time, I'm going to very, very quickly show you a real world procedure I built because these have all been kind of fake examples, like I've said, just kind of showing off the basics. So I'm going to show you something I actually made, and it's called Quick Pivot. And I'm going to run it and then start talking because it takes about a minute to run. So hit F5 and then show you, because pivoting in SQL, as anyone who's used the pivot syntax knows, it was designed by the devil to ruin the hearts of honest men. I don't like writing pivot statements in SQL, but I don't like having to go and paste my stuff into Excel to pivot there. So what if I could have a utility that looks up all the values that are found for the column in question for the where clause I have constructed, makes a new column for every one of them and does the pivoting for me? Well, that would be a lot of pain to write myself. And as soon as you change the date range, there might be new values to consider. So I'm going to have to like fiddle with the columns every time. There could be a lot of different values. I've got to write a lot of different columns. You see where I'm going with it. These are the sort of signs you should make yourself suspect. Could I do that dynamically instead of maintaining this weird fiddly pivot query, or God forbid, actually writing pivot with SQL standard syntax? And as we chug along, this is not an especially slow query. It's more that I'm running this just on my computer. This isn't a SQL server on bare metal. This is literally my home desktop. You'll notice that line break option doesn't persist session to session, or at least if it does, I haven't figured out how to make it. So, but I have a query, and look at this. I said, look at every vote, format so that it gives you the month, look for everything that's more in 2010, okay? And then it went ahead, and this query found every value for the vote type. I didn't tell it these. These values aren't written anywhere in the procedure, okay? It found them itself, and it did the summing for me, and it gave me a nice little grand total. And how did it achieve this magic? Well, very briefly, we took the report columns, right? In this case, there was only one column, so it didn't need to really do this. And as a quick note, string split is compatibility level 130. So if you're using the Stack Overflow 2010 database, you'll need to manually up the compatibility level. And then it selected every distinct value and put it in this temp table called pivot values. And that itself was a dynamic query to insert into pivot values. And then I said, okay, You'll notice this design pattern where I frequently reset loop max to be the max for whatever loop I need for what I'm doing. So in this case, I'll say for every report column, in this case, there's one report column, right? That format. And then we said, sure. So go ahead and add that to the string followed by a comma. And then go set loop max again to be the number of pivot values. In that case, pivot values is a table that's got accepted by originator. It's got bounty close. It's got bounty start. And for each one of those, add a new line to the query that says some case when this when the pivot column equals the loop value, then 1 else 0. It added all of those one by one by one by one by one. And then we went ahead, did an order by, we did an option recompile. Let me quick set the, no, it's not worth it. We don't have the time to like, I was hoping to have the line breaks be a little cleaner, but you can see, I'll just kind of like get a couple of them here. So you can see that the lines it's generating kind of looks like this. And then let's go find the from statement. And we did, from that, inner join that, get our where, grouped by, and we ordered by. So that's a very quick example of how dynamic SQL can save you a lot of heartache. Because now I have this one script. It was a one-time development cost of maybe a few hours. And now it works for any number of column, right? If I could do this to a new table, you could put this on your database. There's nothing specific to Stack Overflow in here aside from this tiny little configuration block. All you've got to do is take these, set them to be what you need for your database, and Quick Pivot will work for you. So that, I hope, will kind of inspire you to think that dynamic SQL really can save you a lot of time. And it's not just for these kind of hokey examples I've used for the first few demos. So that, we're going to go hit up the slide deck because we are just about out of time. But does anyone have any final questions? And again, here are the links to reach me. Email is the best way to reach me directly. I check it frequently. LinkedIn is where I will share any SQL content I make going forward. And I am active on Twitter, but I am not only SQL on Twitter. So it's a very personal account, and buyer beware.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other questions. Great job. I appreciate the session. I don't write a lot of dynamic SQL, but I enjoyed seeing how it's done.
Glad to hear it. And like I said, I will try to bundle up these demos, and whenever the transcripts get posted, we can hopefully have a link to these. In particular, of course, I'm in Quick Pivot. Maybe this is something you actually have a need for. Maybe you want to put this on your database and use it. Obviously, I release all liability, use so at your own risk, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is me presenting as an individual, not affiliated with El Camino Health. But yeah,